Hi everyone, it's Joe from Homegrown Musician and welcome back to another video. So in today's video we're going to be talking about MIDI, so what it is, why you're going to need it, and I'll show you some really cool tips and tricks to help you improve your workflow using MIDI. So what is MIDI? So MIDI, or Musical Instrument Digital Interface, is just a way for pieces of hardware and software to talk to each other despite who they were made by. So one way to think about it is if you bought a PlayStation and put an Xbox game in it, it's definitely not going to work, and you don't want that in a music studio. So the idea of MIDI is if I have a Korg synth and a Moog synth and an Arturia synth, I can use MIDI to make all three of them speak to each other despite being made by different manufacturers. So in today's video, we'll start with the most basic way of using MIDI, and that's to write a piece of music inside a DAW. So like I said, you can use MIDI to make hardware talk to each other, but you can also use it to control software instruments. So you don't need a massive grand piano sitting in your back room to write with the piano, you just need a software version inside your DAW. Now most DAWs come with free software instruments, but you can also pay to download third-party ones as well. So I'll be using Logic for this tutorial, but all of the concepts will remain the same and be pretty similar across all DAWs. So the first step is to load up a DAW and make a new instrument track. Now once you've done this, load a virtual instrument into the track. Like I said, not all DAWs will have the same virtual instruments, but almost all of them should come with one or two free ones for you to use. Now once you've done this is kind of the equivalent of having taken your instrument out of the case and having it sit in your lap, but you actually need some music for it to play. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to your main edit window, right click and make new MIDI region, or whatever the equivalent is for your DAW. So MIDI region is where we put the MIDI information for our instruments to read and play back to us. So it's basically like a page to store the notes on. So once you've made a region, double click and you'll open the MIDI region window. Of the left hand side, you'll see a piano roll or something similar. So these are all the notes that your instrument can play. And across the bottom, you'll have your rhythm going left to right. Now MIDI automatically syncs to the global settings of your DAW, so if you're at 4/4 and 120 beats per minute, your MIDI will have 4 beats per bar and play through at a rate of 120 beats per minute, and every time that changes, your MIDI will change with it. So the next step is to add some MIDI notes. Now Logic does this using the pencil tool, so wherever you click with the pencil, a note will be made. The higher you click, the higher the note, and the lower you click, the lower the note. And wherever you click in a bar, a note will be added. So if you click at the beginning, the note will go at the beginning of the bar, the middle, it will go in the middle, and if you click at the end, the note will be put at the end. So one of the best things about MIDI is you can actually change it after you've made it. So unlike a real live performance that you've recorded with a microphone, if you play the wrong note, you can move it to the right pitch. Or if you play it in the wrong place, you can put it where it's supposed to be. So MIDI's really flexible. Now like I said, you can only write MIDI notes inside a MIDI region, so if you run out of space, go back to your edit window and extend the MIDI region, or make a new one. Okay, so we've got the basics down. We know how to make an instrument track, we know how to make a MIDI region, we know how to add notes to it, and we know how to change these notes afterwards. So you've pretty much got everything you need to start making music using MIDI. However, I'm now going to show you a few more advanced techniques to help speed up your workflow and make your MIDI a bit more interesting. So my first tip is all about velocity or note strength. Now that sounds quite complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So if you go into your DAW and select a note, you should see a velocity value. It's normally somewhere along the bottom, but again, it's DAW to DAW dependent. So find your velocity value, and if you move it upwards, you'll get a louder, more aggressive note, and if you move it downwards, you'll get a softer note. Again, this changes dependent on the instrument you're using, but that's the overall idea. Now you can use this in a variety of ways, so stuff like accenting your first and third beats. Remember I talked about that in my mini-series on music theory? You could also do things like pulling certain notes out in a chord to make them louder and stand out more. Or finally, you could use it a bit more compositionally, so you could have a really quiet section that's got really low velocities and a really loud section with really big velocities. So you can use it in a variety of ways. So another really cool thing about MIDI is that you can actually play the notes in. You don't have to write them out. So if you have some keyboard skills and you can play your own melodies or chords or bass lines, whatever, doesn't matter, you can actually play them in. So you don't need anything stupidly expensive. I've got this Akai MPK, cost me £40, dirt cheap, and it's really, really useful for speeding up workflow. So once you've plugged it in, go into your preferences in whichever DAW you're using, find MIDI, and you should see it in a drop-down menu, mark something like MIDI interface or MIDI instrument. After that, go back into your main edit window, record arm your track, and press play to start recording. Once you're doing this, mess about with the keyboard and you'll notice MIDI notes being added, which means it's working. From now on, you can actually play your MIDI in instead of writing it out, which should save you a lot of time. So my next tip is all about the MIDI grid. Now the best way to explain this is watch me move this MIDI note and see what happens. The movement's really jagged and not fluid at all, and the reason is because the note is locking to the grid, at the minute in a value of 1/64th note, which is incredibly small. Now if I move this to a quarter note or a crotchet, remember that from my mini series about music theory? Watch what happens. So my notes will now only move in crotchets. Now this sounds like it'll get in the way, but for example, if you know your kick drum or your bass is only going to be moving in crotchets, then you may as well just set your grid to crotchets and start clicking away, as you know everything's going to be perfectly in time. Also be aware that you can actually turn the grid off and move the notes as freely as you like. So if you've got a really difficult rhythm that you can hear, but you can't necessarily find the grid value for, just do this instead. So it's a really good thing to know about. So my next tip is actually a little bit of a continuation and still revolves around using the grid. So instead of using the grid to help you put new notes in or find tricky rhythms, you can actually play your notes in using your MIDI keyboard, which will be off grid, and then you can select all of them and press this button here to snap the notes to the grid automatically. Now once you've snapped a grid, just give it a quick playthrough to make sure that the snap's been successful, as sometimes it can move the notes to the wrong place accidentally, especially if you're using very small grid values. So my last MIDI tip is using the arrow keys to actually move notes. So if you have a note highlighted in the MIDI selector and you hold down Alt or Option, you can then use the arrow keys to move it up or down in pitch, which is really useful if you just want to quickly change the pitch of a note to see what it'd sound like. Now if you add Shift to that, so Shift, Alt, Arrow key, you'll move a note up and down an octave. So personally, I think this is a really useful shortcut. You can do things like check to see what bass lines would sound like in different octaves. They might even turn out to be great lead lines, or vice versa, a lead line might be a great bass line. Likewise, if you're not too sure on a chord voicing and you think it's a bit boring or a bit basic, take a note in the chord, move it up and down an octave and see how it changes the voicing. Maybe it works better, maybe it works worse, but it's such a quick shortcut that it's really great for experimenting. So that actually brings us to the end of today's video. So I really hope you enjoyed and maybe even learned something new, and if I missed a tip or trick that you'd like to see a video on, just leave a comment below. And remember, please like, share and subscribe as it'd massively help the channel.